I'm adding realistic scenery to my model rail yard at Hodge Junction on Ron's Trains and Things right now. Hi, I'm Ron of Ron's Trains and Things, and I have been expanding my interchange yard at Hodge Junction in Fort Worth, Texas on my BNSF layout. Now, I have all of the tracks laid and painted and functional, and so it's time to begin to finish this scene out, starting with a little bit of scenery. So today, I'm going to be adding ground cover, ballast, static grass, and other scenic details to bring this scene to life. Now, I love doing scenery. It's one of my favorite parts of layout building, so I'm really looking forward to this part of this project. But before we get started, let me take just a few seconds to mention my Ron's Trains and Things merch store. For several years, I have offered my logo on t-shirts, long sleeve shirts like the one I'm wearing, hoodies, drinkware, and the like at my Ron's Trains and Things merch store. Well, recently, I have added a number of new fun designs specifically geared towards model railroaders that I think you will enjoy. So I'm going to encourage you to check those out. Now, you'll see a few of those in the merch stripe down below this video, but to see the full lineup, check out the description where I have a link to my merch store in this and every video description that I publish. But for this video, I'm going to move that near the top of the description and make it easy for you to find. I hope you'll go check it out. I think that you will enjoy some of them. Now, let's head on over to Hodge Junction and build some scenery. This video is brought to you by Midwest Model Railroad. With 15,000 square feet of inventory and one-day shipping, whether in person or online, they are your one-stop model railroad shop. MidwestModelRR.com, link in the description. When we left Hodge Junction in the previous video, I had installed these plexiglass guards around the traffic side of the area to protect trains from passing pedestrian traffic. Now, before I work on scenery, I need to temporarily remove these guards so I don't get adhesives and scenery materials on them. Hodge Junction was the point of origin for the Fort Worth and Denver Railroad. The original line ran west to Amarillo, Texas. It was eventually acquired by the Burlington route, which became Burlington Northern and eventually BNSF. The line today is the Wichita Falls subdivision, which is the bulk of what I model. Somewhere through that history, Hodge Junction was discarded and acquired by a regional short line, and today is part of the Fort Worth and Western Railroad. Today, that yard has been upgraded and expanded, but in the area that I model, it was a small yard that was not highly maintained, and it was somewhat overgrown, the ballast was dirty, and the yard was littered with rundown structures and discarded railroad ties and other various junk. Ultimately, that's what I want to model here. For the scenery process, I first glued down an additional piece of cork to level out the end of the extension where the sanding tower and some other details will live. When the glue had dried for a couple of hours, I masked the tracks to protect them before applying Sculpting to the scene. I mixed up a small amount of Sculpting to fill in gaps, to smooth out some contours, as well as to provide some texture for parts of the yard that were very flat. I like to mix my Sculpting thick at first, and then tint it with some acrylic craft paint. I use a tan color that approximates the color of the ground cover, but really anything that gets away from the white color of the Sculpting mold. I used an artist's trowel to apply the Sculpting mold and smooth it out. I needed to fill the small gaps in the cork where the extension connects to the original part of the layout. I also filled in some rough spots in the foam along the edge of the layout and extending into the north yard area. And I applied a very thin layer to add some texture to the flat areas beyond the yard tracks. When the Sculpting mold was partly set, I used a damp glove to smooth out the high points in the surface. This was a thin application of Sculpting mold, so it dried overnight. Thicker applications may take several days to fully dry. When it was dry, I used some coarse sandpaper to knock down the burrs and high spots. I then thoroughly vacuumed the dust and particles that were left behind. Some of the old scenery in this area had some white Sculpting mold that had not been painted, so I applied a unifying coat of tan paint. There's no one right color to use here. I suggest trying to match the color of aerial reference photos. Usually these show the color of dirt to be much lighter than we tend to think. I personally like khaki-colored craft paint for this step. Some of the lighter tan Sculpting shows through, which is good because variation in color will add realism, and this will mostly be covered by ground cover and other scenery material anyway. I applied ground cover after the paint had dried, but you can apply it into the wet paint and allow the paint to help adhere it. My ground cover is very fine dirt collected from my yard and sifted, then mixed 50-50 with buff or light tan unsanded grout. The grout makes a solid base layer and it helps keep the dirt from turning dark, which it will tend to do whenever it is applied onto glue. I sift the ground cover onto the layout through an old stocking. I then wet the entire area with 70% isopropyl alcohol with a spray bottle, which will reveal any thin spots in the ground cover, which I fix immediately. With the area saturated with IPA, I spray on a layer of scenic glue. There are a number of products that you can use here, but currently I use matte Mod Podge mixed 50-50 with distilled water. The isopropyl alcohol helps break the surface tension of the glue and encourages it to flow through the ground cover evenly. You'll notice that I've used masking paper to cover the fascia, and I have a drop cloth on the floor under the area. With the glue applied, I sprinkle on a bit more ground cover in areas that look too thin or where the glue is tending to slightly pool. If you have an area that has a lot of pooling glue, you can absorb some of that glue back off of the layout with the edge of a paper towel. I went ahead and removed the masking from the tracks while everything was wet, just to keep from getting it glued down to the layout. I let this glue dry completely before ballasting. For ballast, I'm using some reddish-brown ballast that I had on hand. It wasn't in the original package, but this ballast is real crushed rock, probably from Arizona Rock and Mineral, but I'm not sure the exact color. I just knew that I had it and that the color was close to what I wanted for this yard. It is completely different from the gray-colored ballast that I'll use on North Yard and on the main line. I use a plastic spoon to apply the ballast. I start between the rails, spread it with a soft brush, and then with my finger to remove most of it from the ties. I then applied it to the sides of the track, spreading and shaping it in much the same way. I work carefully around the turnouts, adding only a small amount of ballast so that it will not interfere with the switch points. I throw the points back and forth several times to make sure that no ballast is interfering with their operation. When the ballast was all in place, I applied IPA with a pipette, working along the rail so as not to disturb the ballast and allowing it to flow into adjacent areas. I work along one track at a time, then added some scenic glue as before. I made sure all of the ballast turned white with glue without completely flooding it. Again, when I did apply too much adhesive, I soaked up the extra with the edge of a paper towel. In the turnout areas, I tried to work carefully not to get glue on the points, but this is almost impossible to accomplish. To solve the problem of gluing the points to the track, I try to wick up any excess glue from around the points, and then I simply keep throwing the points back and forth periodically as the glue dries. Let me pause here for just a moment to say that if you're enjoying this video and would like to see more model railroad tips, tools, and techniques to help you build your dream layout, then be sure to subscribe down below and click the little bell icon so you can catch future videos. While everything was drying, I created the foundation of the old sand house for this area. This is built of scraps of various thicknesses of styrene stacked and cemented together. I tried to match as much as possible the one reference photo that I have on hand. I also cut the foundation for an adjacent shanty which I will scratch build in a future video. I sanded the surface of the styrene lightly to create a struck concrete texture. The base color for the foundation is Vallejo Model Air Cement Gray, which I applied in 2 light coats with a brush. I allowed the brush strokes to further enhance that struck concrete texture. When that had dried, I applied a dark gray wash, and then a burnt umber wash to weather it. Once these had dried, I was really happy with the look of the old, weathered, dirty concrete foundation. I glued the foundation to the layout using Beacon 3-in-1 glue. This is a great adhesive that I use for many scenery applications. I also added a bit of touch-up paint and some further weathering wash to the footings of the sanding tower that I had glued in place earlier. Next, it was time for some vegetation. I know many have abandoned using ground foam for ground cover entirely, but I like to use a little in select spots underneath static grass to simulate undergrowth. This is summer in North Texas, so I applied mostly burnt grass color from Woodland Scenics. Again, I apply this sparingly and mostly in areas where water might tend to pool and grass would be a little healthier and greener. I also applied some in small amounts between the ties between the rails. When done, I vacuumed up the excess. I then used a microbrush to clean any foam off the ties, leaving only the grass between the ties. I used some white and yellow ground foam between the rails to simulate spillage. A yard like this will always have some piles of something that has leaked out of the hatches of some covered hoppers somewhere. Then it was time to add static grass. Being in scale, I applied 2mm and 4mm grass. First, I applied the 2mm, a combination of autumn color and hay color from Silflor. I wish I had some straw colored on hand, especially in the 4mm grass, as this grass really should be even more brown, but this will work in this area. I applied the grass with my Woodland Scenics Static King. I've used a number of different static grass applicators over time, but the Static King is the best of them hands down. It works on either battery or wall power, and it really makes the grass stand up. I'll post a link to the Static King in my Amazon Pick of the Week in the description down below this video if you'd like to check one out. I personally highly recommend them. To apply the static grass, I stippled on scenic glue with a brush. I often see people apply a complete coverage of glue for static grass, but stippling it on like this leaves some areas of dirt showing and it clumps the grass together, which gives a much more realistic look for a wild field like this area. I work a small area at a time so the glue doesn't dry before I apply the grass. I hold the applicator as close to the surface as I can, holding the grounding pin on the layout as near the applicator as possible, and shake on the grass. I allow the grass to sit in the glue for a few minutes, then use an old stocking over the end of my vacuum hose to suck up any excess grass, but to save it for future use. You will always drop way more grass than sticks in the glue, so reusing the excess is a very economical step. I pour it into a bowl and then put it back into the applicator for reuse. I repeat these steps over and over until I have worked over the whole yard. I put a little of this 2mm grass between the tracks, as well as good coverage on each side of the yard. After the 2mm grass had had a few hours to dry, I applied some 4mm grass, using only the brown autumn color. I put this mostly in some of the dirt patches left in my first application, but tufted some of it into patches of the shorter grass as well. To detail the scenery, I added some various sizes, colors, and textures of grass tufts from Martin Welberg Studios. These are fantastic scenery materials and can be found at scenicexpress.com. With the static grass applied as I did, simulating tufted grass, it only takes a few of these detailed tufts to really make the scene stand out and come to life. I applied these tufts using that Beacon 3-in-1 glue that I used earlier. This is one of the adhesives that Martin Welberg himself recommends. Take care to burnish the edges of the tufts into the scenery so they aren't sitting on top of the scenery materials you have already applied. And with that, the scenery at Hodge Junction is complete. The triangular dirt area behind the yard will become home to a yard office and an access road, and I have to build and install that shanty and install a lot of other detail parts, but those will be the subject of future videos. In the meantime, if you'd like to see more about how I extended Hodge Junction or other scenery projects, check out the links on your screen. Also, be sure to check out my Amazon Pick of the Week, my merch store link, and other great links in the description below. And join me on Fridays as I bring you even more great model railroad videos. And I'll see you on the next video. 10, Lizzie?